Greetings, everybody. Welcome. Welcome and greetings to the Wisconsin Science Festival online field trip. As we join, make sure that you can hear my voice and you're in a comfortable spot. We'll get started here in a minute. So my name is Dan. I'd like to welcome you all to the Wisconsin Science Festival online field trip, where we're going to be doing a BioBlitz all week of the festival. And we have here with us some nature explorers from the Aldo Leopold Nature Center here with us. So how can you participate today? You'll notice that your picture and audio are muted, but if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, you can use the Q&A feature, and I'll read your question out loud for you on your behalf. So as soon as you have a question, go ahead and type that in right away. This field trip will be recorded, and as always, we ask that you do this and all activities at the Wisconsin Science Festival with a responsible adult. We'd also like to thank all our sponsors and partners that help make the Wisconsin Science Festival possible. You can find out more activities all week and events during the festival at wisconsinsciencefest.org and join the Wisconsin Science Festival BioBlitz. So with that, I'm going to have my colleague Felipe take it away.
Bienvenidos y saludos a todos los científicos y científicas que están con nosotros hoy. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Gracias por participar hoy en la excursión virtual del Centro de Naturaleza Aldo Leopold. Si quieren participar en algunas otras excursiones o eventos que vamos a tener esta semana, por favor visiten wisconsinsciencefest.org. Para participar en nuestras actividades tienen que hacerlo con un adulto, y si tienen algunas preguntas mientras nuestra excursión, por favor háganlas en los comentarios. Muchas gracias, hay que empezar.
Thanks, Felipe. And with that, we're ready to get started. And I'll have Melissa and Brian from the Aldo Leopold Nature Center take us away on our nature adventure.
Great. Hi, everybody. So my name is Brian.
And I'm Melissa.
And we're educators here at the Aldo Leopold Nature Center. We are a nature center located in Monona, Wisconsin, just outside of Madison. We have about 15 acres of habitat here. And our goal today is to focus on the wetland. But I understand that we have students from all around the state joining us today. So we just wanted to show you on the map where we are doing our online field trip today.
So if you look at the map.
Okay, so right here in the southern part of the state is Madison, and we are just east of that off of Lake Monona. So we're in the city of Monona, so here in the southern part of the state. We have a beautiful day today. Sun's out, it's a beautiful temperature for our virtual field trip today to learn about our ponds and wetlands here at the Nature Center.
So we are going to spend some time just talking about, like, how do you know if the pond is healthy? We're going to talk about different tests that we do, and then we're going to show you some of the things that we went out and caught earlier today. Also, since we're doing a BioBlitz, we try to keep track of the number of species that we caught.
So today we're going to focus on two different factors that impact pond health, wetland health. We're going to be talking about abiotic factors and biotic factors. And the difference between the two is that abiotic means non-living and biotic means living. And all of those factors together form an ecosystem, and it can impact the health of that ecosystem. So examples of abiotic factors could be water temperature, the pH of the water, how clear the water is, water clarity, and how much dissolved oxygen there is in the water for living things to breathe. Some biotic factors, so biotic is living. We can assess the plants, and we'll talk about invertebrates and other animals that call our wetland home here today.
Yep, so we just wanted to do just a quick demo. When you're testing like both abiotic and biotic, it's really important to know both, just because so many things rely on like what the temperature of the pond is or how much oxygen is in the pond. So these are some of the tests that we use. We're not going to do the test, but we just wanted to just kind of show you which ones. One of the things that we look at, Brian had mentioned, is we look at the temperature And the tool for that is just, it's a simple thermometer that we submerge into the water. When we're looking at temperature, we like to look at what's the temperature at the surface and then what's the temperature down low. And depending on the time of the year, it actually does change. So often during summer and winter, there will be a temperature difference between the top and the bottom. And then like right now and in the spring, this is time when the temperature, if they're the same, we get a lot of mixing in the pond, which is really important too. So temperature is one of them. Another one that we look at is like when Brian had mentioned clarity. So this is kind of a cool tool we use for clarity. This is called a Secchi disc, and it's pretty easy to use. All you do is just submerge it into the water, and then you're going to pull it back up until you can finally see the disc again, and you just measure the depth. So if you can see it further down, it means the water's clear, versus if you can't. Clarity is important because if the water is really cloudy, the sunlight can't necessarily make it to the bottom of the pond where some of the plants are. And also if the water is really cloudy, it tends to make the temperature go up. So all these factors are related to that. Another one we look at is the pH, and that's kind of how much acid is in the water. This is important for when plants grow. This is an easy test. You just dip the sample or the strip in, and then all you do is it's just matching the colors, which is nice and easy. We measured it earlier today. It was about 6. 7 is neutral, so that's like in the middle. So it's a little bit below neutral. And then the last thing we look at is dissolved oxygen, and this is how much oxygen is in the water, because we need oxygen. The way we get it, simply we can breathe. Fish and other insects are going to use oxygen that's in the water. So it's a simple test where you get a water sample and you just match with the colors, because there'll be chemicals in this tube right here, and then they'll interact with the water, and then it changes color based on how much oxygen is. So with this one, when we're looking, it's pretty easy to just kind of match up where it fits on the gradient. I think we had decided it was around 6 or 8 today. So those are the abiotic things that we look at, because the results of this is going to impact what we find over others.
And with that, I think we can go ahead and take a closer look at our pond and the wetland that we're going to be working with today and assessing the health of this ecosystem. So as we walk out here, maybe we can think about, does this look like a habitat that seems healthy? And we'll do a little bit of a test later to see if that's accurate, but just looking around, noticing the vegetation along the shore, looking at the water, just trying to notice what looks healthy about this ecosystem. And our pond here was human made, so it was dug out about 40 years ago. And its max depth is about 10 feet, 15 feet, depending on where you are in the pond and depending on how high the water is. It's been pretty low up until about a few days ago. We got a lot of rain. So we've been in a drought and our pond level was really low. Now it's up a little bit. So I'm interested to see how that affects what's living in the pond and what we might find today. So what I'm going to do is our standard practice for when we do a pond dip to try to get living creatures into our containers to get closer looks at. I have a net here, pond net, and I'm just going to kind of swish back and forth in the water. And most of the living things like to live in the plants and along the shoreline, maybe sometimes even down in the mud. So I'm going to try to use this net to scoop up through the plants, maybe get a little mud. Right. I'll do one scoop on this side.
All right, Brian's going to bring it back, and we'll kind of look at what we have. Other than some of the smaller things, we have bigger things. We don't have like really big fish because our pond is connected to a wetland, so there's not a lot of oxygen like flowing through. So we have things like snapping turtles and painted turtles. We do have a couple species of fish, which are like bullheads, and there's something called fathead minnows, and then frogs and stuff.
All right, so Kara, I don't know if we can zoom in on this pan, but this is one scoop from the net. So this is just what we just did along the pond, and we can see several species. So if we just hold the camera over this pan here and just show the movement. So obviously I think everybody can see the larger creature in there. And if anybody's trying to guess what that is a tadpole. So we have bullfrog tadpoles that actually overwinter. So they spend all winter underneath the ice in the water that isn't frozen. They'll be growing, turning into frogs. And then next year, once they lose their tail and grow their legs, we'll have adult bullfrogs. And we have a few different species of frogs at our pond. We see green frogs, leopard frogs, chorus frogs, and also bullfrogs. But even smaller than that bullfrog, we're seeing lots of what we call invertebrates. And that's what we're going to actually focus our biotic index on. And I think that actually is a good segue into our question. So we have a poll question regarding invertebrates. So maybe we can pull that up and give you a little bit of time to look that over. And then we can talk about what an invertebrate is.
Awesome. So I'm going to launch the poll question now and read it aloud. And Felipe will also read this question in Spanish. So what is an invertebrate? Our options are an animal that breathes underwater, an animal that doesn't have a backbone, an animal that does have a backbone, or an animal that breathes through its butt.
Y ahora en español. ¿Qué es un invertebrado? Un animal que respira bajo el agua, un animal que no tiene columna vertebral, un animal que tiene columna vertebral o un animal que respira por su cola.
We're getting some answers. We're thinking. Give everybody just a little bit more time. And last chance. Here we go. So our results were, some people think it's an animal that breathes underwater, but most people think that it's an animal that doesn't have a backbone.
Awesome. Yeah, so that is correct. So an invertebrate is an animal that does not have a vertebrae, which is another word for a backbone. So when we think of animals with vertebrae, like mammals and reptiles, amphibians, fish, all those animals have backbones and they have skeletons on their inside, but invertebrates don't have a vertebrae, don't have a backbone, and they usually have what we call an exoskeleton. And what we're going to focus on today in our pond is the different invertebrates that we find in our pond, because they're actually what we call indicator species of how healthy our pond is. So within what we caught here, we do have a couple different vertebrate species. We already talked about the bullfrog. We'll talk about a couple others that we see, but mostly we see invertebrates. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually...
Hey, Brian,
yes.
There is
Yes.
a question coming up.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, so someone's wondering, so are we going to see animals today? So are invertebrates animals?
That is a good question. And yes, invertebrates are animals. So when we group living things into plants or animals or bacteria, all invertebrates fall under animals. So we can consider everything we see today an animal. Sometimes it's confused with like a mammal. So we're not looking at mammals. These are some insects. And we have some other different terms for the invertebrates. They're all grouped together, but they are all animals. That's a good question.
Wonderful. Yeah, nature is all around us. And maybe there is one
That's
more
right.
question when we get to maybe talking about the health of the pond. And they want to
Okay.
know how the oxygen, or how does the oxygen get into the water?
Oh, that's a great question. There's a couple different ways. Actually, one of the ways is just the wind blowing and like stirring up the surface of the water. And then another major one is we have plants living in the pond. And one of the things that plants do when they're making food through photosynthesis, one of the things that they make and kind of spit out as extra as like a waste product is oxygen. So trees do this too, but the oxygen goes into the air, but then we have plants that are under the water and they release the oxygen. That's a good question.
Yes,
Yep.
awesome. Thank you guys.
And like water is H2O, so there is oxygen in water. So that means there's two hydrogen and one oxygen. So they form together to make water. And like Melissa said, there's lots of different ways for that oxygen to mix in to make it dissolved and breathable for those animals that use gills to breathe the water. So I think what we're going to do now is we're just going to quickly move through some of the different species that we found here in our pond dip. We are doing a BioBlitz, so keeping track of the amount of species that we're seeing. So we'll just kind of go one at a time. And Melissa, do you want to share the first person that we found?
One thing too I wanted to point out is when you're looking in the water, sometimes people think like healthy water is clear, it's blue, like it's real, like just there's nothing in there. And when we're looking at the pond, something like this where the water, I don't know if you can tell on the screen, but it does have like a little bit of a tinge to it, which is a good thing for the animals. So sometimes people will look and be like, it's brown water, it's not healthy, but that's actually not the case a lot of times, especially for our pond here. So like Brian mentioned earlier, when we do like the index to figure out how healthy the pond is, we do focus on things that are invertebrates without backbones. So that's what most of the stuff that we have, but we do have a couple of things that are vertebrates. One thing I did want to mention too is people that, like, if you want to be a scientist that studies the water or what lives in the water, you would be a limnologist. And they are going to study different factors. And actually, the university in Madison has a really good limnology department. So, yeah. Okay, I want to show you this one first. So even though these things are really small, they have a lot of really, really cool, if you've heard the word adaptations before. And these are kind of either body parts or things that these animals do to help them survive, right? So this is right here, this is a really cool invertebrate. This is, people think right away it looks kind of like a stick, and they'll, a lot of times when kids are here, they'll be like, oh, it's a walking stick, but it's actually called a water scorpion. And there's two of them in here, if you can see that. It is an insect, so it's going to have 6 legs. But the cool thing about this one here is that, I don't know if you can see, there's like this, looks like a long line coming out of their abdomen here at the end. And that's actually a hollow tube that they can breathe out of. So it's hard to tell on the screen, but whenever these things are in the water, they'll have their bodies submerged. But then that little tube always comes to the surface. And it's kind of like a snorkel if anybody's been snorkeling before. And it allows them to hunt and just stay underwater, but then still be able to get the oxygen that they need to survive. So there's 2 of them in here. They'll hunt other insects. They have like these really cool appendages at the front that bend a little bit more. And they have like the little hooks on the end to help them grasp. So some of our invertebrates, even though they're tiny little insects, they'll actually eat other tiny insects that we have for other use. This is one of my favorites. So.
All right, so if we move on to our next one here, was in here. So we had a crawling water beetle, and this is an insect. So all beetles are insects, and they have wings that are next to each other. Maybe we can show the picture here. So the crawling water beetle almost looks like a ladybug, but it spends most of its time, if not its whole life, in the water. And it just uses its legs and crawls around through the water. And yeah, so there we can get a zoom in, and it just kind of zooms around as it crawls through the water. So that's a beetle, an insect that usually is really small, one of the smaller invertebrates that we'll see in our pond.
The next one we found is, we have a lot of snails here. We have a couple of different types. We have some that have shells that look like, well, one is using the other one. Maybe you can see they're kind of like a spiral, and that's an orb snail. And then we have these other ones where it's kind of a traditional like shell here. And, they're either called gilled or pouch snails, and those are actually really fun. I don't know if you can see on there, but it's certainly not. You can see its little antenna. Snails are not insects. They're actually mollusks, so they're kind of in the same family as like an octopus or clams. We do have clams in our pond. We didn't pull any up today. But if you notice, a lot of the things are a little bit on the smaller end, right? These are all full grown. They're not babies. They just don't get as big as other things like invertebrates.
All right, next we'll move on to another invertebrate. This is an insect called a back swimmer. And you can tell based on its name, it gives you a clue as to how it swims. So it actually is swimming on its back right now. And its side that's facing the top is dark. And then underneath, if we were to flip it over, it would be white. And that's so it can actually stay camouflaged from animals that are below it, maybe like a fish that's looking up, and it blends in with the air above the water. And then let's say maybe a bird or a turtle or frog above the water, it blends in to the pond from looking down. So it's actually camouflaged both ways, and it swims on its back. It's a really good swimmer, but it also can fly. So it comes out of the water and it can fly around. And these things actually do have a pretty painful bite. If you were to hold it and kind of like squeeze it, they can protect themselves with a bite.
I'm gonna try to just get one.
Oh yeah, there's one. See if we can see the other side. They also have red eyes that when you look up close, you can see their red eyes stand out.
Wow. There was a question about when you mentioned that the back swimmer can bite. Someone is wondering about the water scorpion, if that one is venomous, or if any of these other creatures that we're looking at are poisonous.
That is a great question. And with the name water scorpion, it kind of implies that maybe it would be. But really its name just comes from the breathing tube on its backside that resembles a scorpion. So it is not venomous, and none of the invertebrates that we're catching today would be considered venomous. However, the water scorpion, with its pinchers, if you were to hold a water scorpion and put your finger in front of its pinchers, it would probably pinch you. But that I would say is unlikely, and it's definitely not venomous. But good question.
Some insects that we have in the ponds, they'll actually spend part of their life cycle in the water and then another part out. And one of them that's a really good example is dragon. So this is what you would call like a baby dragonfly. We call them, the scientific name is a nymph. And we have a couple different kinds that hang out in the pond, but a lot of times they'll stay in the water for a couple of years before they'll emerge, and then the adult will emerge out. And then the adult will, I think you've probably seen these flying around, and adults will actually hunt other insects, right? But this is what the one stage is. So they lay their eggs and they hatch in the water, they stay in the water to find other things, and then when it's time to become an adult, they'll climb out. And then their skin splits down the back, and the adult will actually emerge out of them. This is one of my favorites. We have a couple of different breeds of them, so like they look different because they're going to be different types of dragonflies when they're.
That's fascinating that you mentioned about the life cycle being in underwater or in the air or on land. So
Yep.
someone's asking a question about then what happens when it gets cold outside? So it's coming up to winter. What's going to happen to all of these organisms in the wintertime?
So this is part of some of the, like sometimes people will underestimate insects because they're little and they're not very exciting compared to like a tiger or something, but I think they have some of the coolest adaptations to survive. So in the winter, it gets cold here, we get snow, the surface will freeze. It usually goes down about 6 feet. And Brian had mentioned earlier that the pond is up to 10 feet in a lot of areas. So our pond does not freeze all the way solid. And a lot of these animals will kind of go into like slow down mode, I guess I would say. They don't go to sleep and they're not hibernating, but they just don't move as much. So then they don't have to eat as much, don't require as much energy. They will hang out underneath the ice all winter long. And then when it thaws again in the spring, then they're okay again. So everything in the pond, like we don't really have anything that everything dies because it gets too cold. Because even things like tadpoles or our minnows, all of them are safe. The ice kind of creates a blanket over the top of the pond to help keep it from freezing. So they are just fine all winter. Thanks for that question. That was a good one. Although it doesn't feel like winter's coming today.
I know.
This is
All right, so we didn't get a chance to go through every species we found, but in total, we have 12 species from just our pond dip here with that net. So 10 invertebrate species, 2 vertebrate species with the tadpole, and we have a minnow in our pond, one of the 2 fish species we have in our wetland here. Yeah, so here's our minnow. So 12 total species. And we mentioned we're doing a biotic index to tell how healthy our pond is. And there's a formula that scientists have put together with what we call indicator species. So not every single animal that we find in our pond is necessarily telling us how healthy our pond is, but scientists have narrowed down which species can tell us if our pond is healthy, because there's some that are very sensitive to the abiotic factors that we talked about in the pond, and some of those being pollutants. And there's some that are very tolerant, meaning that if our pond was somewhat polluted, we would be finding a lot of those and not a lot of the things that are sensitive to those tolerants. So we did a little bit of math really quick based on some of the indicator species that we caught. So the dragonfly nymph we talked about, the damselfly nymph, the snails, those are all considered indicator species. And we plug what we catch into a formula. And if we do a little bit of math, 8 divided by 3, Melissa, so that's 2.67. And that falls on our scale of just on the lower end of good. So the scale for good would be 2.6 to 3.5, the score that we get. So based on what we caught, it spits out this number, 2.67. That falls in the good, and it could be anywhere from poor, fair, good to excellent. So whenever we do a biotic index of our pond, and we've been doing this for years throughout different times of the year, I'd say this falls in pretty much, we're usually in that 2 to 3 range. So we're not often catching the invertebrates that are really sensitive to pollutants, but we are often catching insects that are semi-sensitive, and they tell us that our pond health is overall pretty good. And maybe when we were scanning out and looking, some of you were thinking about the pond health and how it looks. I would argue that looking at our pond, it shows signs that it's a pretty healthy ecosystem right now.
And then we do the biotic index at different times of year too, because depending on the time of year, even at different locations around the pond, we're going to get a different thing. So when we're doing the science for this, we usually try to sample in a bunch of different spots. We'll sample at a bunch of different times of year. Like my group I had with me earlier today, we did all the testing this morning, and we test once a month just to see if we can see any changes or patterns as we go through the year.
Probably one point that I want to close with is wetlands and ponds are really important habitats. And often when people think of those habitats, they think of the larger animals that live in there, ducks, fish, geese, turtles, frogs. And those are really important animals, and the pond and wetland is really important for them. But there's a whole other ecosystem that sometimes goes unnoticed. So these smaller invertebrates, and these are just as important for the health of the pond and indicate a healthy ecosystem. So all those things that we talked about, the non-living and the living, no matter what size, they all fit together in a balanced ecosystem. And making sure that we protect those ecosystems helps us realize that all of these animals are connected to one another, and the smallest to the biggest are all important factors of that habitat.
Brian, couldn't have said it better myself. That is wonderful. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And hopefully you can understand a little bit more about how these keen observations of the land and nature around us can help us just learn so many things And it's also really important science to collect this information to understand our world and how it might be changing over time. So thank you so much, and be sure to participate in the Wisconsin Science Festival BioBlitz by joining wisconsinsciencefest.org. Felipe?
Recuerden que tenemos actividades toda la semana y si quieren visitarnos, pueden visitarnos en wisconsinsciencefest.org. Tenemos actividades toda la semana y si quieren visitar al Centro de Naturaleza Aldo Leopold, está en Monona y pueden buscarlo también en nuestra página de internet. Y muchas gracias. Hasta luego.